Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we return to Pennsylvania. Not the bustling corridors of Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, but the forgotten places. The hollow towns tucked between ridges where coal dust still clings to windowsills. The farmhouses at the end of unmarked roads where porch lights flicker for no reason. The abandoned churches where footsteps echo long after the last service ended. These are the stories the Commonwealth keeps buried beneath layers of folklore and official silence. Stories whispered in diners at dawn by third-shift workers who refuse to drive certain routes anymore. Accounts filed away in county records with notes that don't quite add up. Testimonies given once, then never repeated. Pennsylvania's small towns carry weight. The weight of industry that died too quickly, of land that remembers what was done to it, of families who've lived in the same valley for 200 years and know better than to speak about certain things. Tonight, we've gathered 10 such accounts. Real voices, real fear, real places you could drive to tomorrow if you dared. If you're drawn to the kind of truth that lingers in the dark, make sure to subscribe and stay with us tonight. The banging started at 2:47 in the morning, and it came from a basement that didn't exist. I was standing in the upstairs hallway of the rental property on Chestnut Street, flashlight in hand, when I heard it. 3 heavy impacts against what sounded like a metal door, followed by a scraping sound that lasted exactly 8 seconds. I'd been doing property inspections in Bedford County for 9 years. I knew the difference between pipe settling and something else. The house had been empty for 6 months. No utilities connected except the water main. No heat. The November air inside was cold enough that I could see my breath even with my coat on. I'd been hired by the bank to assess the property before foreclosure sale finalized. Standard job. 4-bedroom colonial, built in 1924. Nothing unusual in the file except a note that the previous tenants had broken their lease early, forfeiting their deposit without explanation. My name is Marcus Holloway. I'm 41 years old, and I've inspected over 300 properties across western Pennsylvania. I grew up in Cumberland, Maryland, just across the state line, and I learned early that old houses make noise. They settle, they creak, they breathe in their own way. I'd never been spooked by a property before that night in Hindman, but this house had no basement. I'd checked the architectural survey twice before entering. Single foundation, crawl space access only, 8-foot clearance beneath the main floor. The realtor had confirmed it. The county records confirmed it. I'd even walked the exterior perimeter with a measuring tape that afternoon. The foundation sat directly on bedrock with no excavation for a cellar. The banging came again. Same rhythm. 3 strikes, pause, then that long scraping sound like something heavy being dragged across concrete. I descended the staircase slowly, each step groaning under my weight. The first floor was stripped bare. No furniture, no curtains, just dust and the faint smell of mildew. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I moved toward the kitchen, where the only access to the crawl space was located. The small wooden hatch in the kitchen floor was closed, secured with the same rusty latch I'd noted during my initial walkthrough. Undisturbed. But the sound was coming from directly beneath where I stood. I knelt and pressed my ear to the floorboards. Silence for nearly a minute. Then I heard it. Not banging this time, but voices. Multiple voices, muffled and distant, speaking in what sounded like an argument. Words I couldn't make out, but the cadence was clear. One voice low and angry, another pleading. I pulled the hatch open. The crawl space below was exactly as I'd seen it 6 hours earlier. Dirt floor, support beams, old ductwork, and a tangle of disconnected wiring. My flashlight revealed nothing but empty space and the smell of damp earth. The voices stopped the moment the hatch opened. I should have left then. Every instinct told me to close that hatch, walk out the front door, and call the sheriff's office. But I'm methodical. I document everything. So I lowered myself into the crawl space, dropping the 4 feet to the ground with my flashlight clenched between my teeth. The clearance was tight. I had to crouch to move, but I began working my way toward the foundation wall where the sounds had originated. The dirt was soft beneath my boots, undisturbed for what looked like decades. No footprints, no marks of any kind. That's when I saw the door. It was set into the foundation wall, nearly invisible in the darkness. Old wood, iron hinges, maybe 3 feet high and 2 feet wide. A child-sized door that shouldn't exist because there was no space beyond that wall. I'd measured the exterior. There was nothing but earth and bedrock on the other side. The door was slightly ajar. I reached out and touched the wood. It was cold, slick with moisture, and when I pulled it open wider, the smell that emerged made me gag. Rot and copper and something chemical, like formaldehyde. Beyond the door was a staircase leading down. Wooden steps, steep and narrow, disappearing into absolute darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. The beam just died about 10 feet down, swallowed by something thicker than shadow. I heard the voices again, clearer now, coming from the bottom of those stairs. "Please, I didn't know. You took it. You knew exactly what you were doing." "I can get it back, I swear. Just give me time." Then a sound like a hammer striking meat. I stumbled backward, cracking my head against a support beam hard enough to see stars. My flashlight fell, rolling across the dirt floor, and in those few seconds of disorientation, I heard footsteps ascending the stairs. Fast, heavy footsteps. I scrambled for my flashlight, grabbed it, and swung the beam toward the door just as something emerged. I saw a hand first, pale, too long, fingers bent at wrong angles, gripping the door frame. Then a face began to lean into the light, but it wasn't a face. It was a mask made of skin, stitched crudely together from different tones and textures, with eyes that didn't blink, and a mouth that hung open, revealing teeth filed to points. I ran. I don't remember crawling out of that space, or climbing the stairs, or getting to my truck. I remember being in the driver's seat, door locked, engine running, parked 3 blocks away, with my hands shaking so badly I couldn't grip the steering wheel. I called the sheriff's office at 3:30 in the morning, told them I'd heard voices in an abandoned property and thought there might be squatters. I didn't mention the basement or the door or what I'd seen. I knew how that would sound. 2 deputies met me at the property just after 4. We went inside together, and I led them to the kitchen hatch. They searched the crawl space with their own flashlights while I waited upstairs. There was no door in the foundation wall. They found the support beams, the ductwork, the loose wiring. They found the spot where my flashlight had rolled, leaving a clear track in the dust, but the wall was solid stone. No door, no opening, no stairs leading down. One of the deputies asked if I'd been drinking. I said no. He suggested that old houses play tricks in the dark. That sounds echoes strangely, that fatigue can cause hallucinations. I nodded and thanked them and left. I submitted my inspection report the next day, noting structural concerns and recommending further evaluation before sale. I didn't mention what I'd experienced. The bank sold the property 4 months later to a developer who planned to renovate it into office space. But I started asking questions, careful questions to people who'd lived in Hindman for generations. An elderly woman who worked at the County Historical Society told me the house had been built by a doctor named Everett Marsh. He'd practiced medicine in Hindman from 1924 until 1941, when he disappeared. His wife claimed he'd left her, but neighbors reported hearing screaming from the house on multiple nights that final winter. The police investigated, but found nothing unusual. What they did find, according to a newspaper clipping the woman showed me, were rumors. Rumors about patients who went to Dr. Marsh for treatment and were never seen again. Rumors about a private morgue he'd built beneath his home where he conducted research. Rumors about doors that appeared and disappeared. The Historical Society had a photograph of Dr. Marsh. He was thin, severe-looking, standing beside his black medical bag. But his hands were wrong in the picture. Too long, fingers bent at angles that didn't match human anatomy. The woman told me the house had been investigated twice more over the decades. Once in 1967, when a family heard voices and called police. Once in 1989, when renovation workers refused to continue after tools went missing and they heard banging from walls that had no hollow spaces. Each time, authorities found nothing. I haven't been back to Hindman. I stopped taking inspection jobs in Bedford County altogether. But I still have dreams about that basement, the one that shouldn't exist. Dreams where I'm descending those stairs into darkness, and I can hear Dr. Marsh's voice echoing up from below, asking if I'd like to see his collection. The official record states there is no basement at 412 Chestnut Street. The architectural surveys confirm it. The county records confirm it. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that door's still there, waiting in a space that shouldn't exist, for someone else to open it. If you've ever found a door in your home that wasn't there before, don't open it. Some thresholds aren't meant to be crossed. The trail camera captured something at 4:38 in the morning, and by the time I saw the footage, 2 people were already missing. I was sitting in my truck outside the state police barracks in Bloomsburg when Trooper Donnelly called me over to look at his laptop. The image on the screen showed a clearing in dense woods, illuminated by infrared. A deer feeder hung from a tree on the right side of the frame, and standing directly in front of the camera, maybe 8 feet away, was a woman in a white dress. She was facing the camera, completely still. Her eyes were open, reflecting the infrared like an animal's, and her mouth was open too, stretched impossibly wide as if she were singing or screaming, though the camera captured no audio. My name is Rachel Koenig. I'm 36 years old, and I work as a wildlife biologist for the Pennsylvania Game Commission. I've spent the better part of a decade studying deer populations and predator patterns across Columbia County, which means I've reviewed thousands of trail camera images. I've seen bears, coyotes, bobcats, and more than a few trespassers. I'd never seen anything like the woman in white. The camera belonged to a hunter named Vincent Torres. He'd mounted it on his property near Millville 2 weeks earlier to monitor deer activity before rifle season. When he checked the SD card, he found 37 images taken over 6 hours, all featuring the same woman standing in the exact same position, facing the camera with that stretched open mouth. Vincent had called the state police because he recognized the woman. Her name was Judith Reardon. She'd been reported missing 3 days earlier. Trooper Donnelly told me they'd already searched Vincent's property. No sign of Judith, no footprints in the clearing despite muddy conditions. The deer feeder showed clear evidence of animal activity. Disturbed ground, scattered corn. But around the spot where the woman stood, nothing. The earth was smooth and undisturbed, as if she'd been hovering inches above the ground. They'd called me because of the location. Vincent's property bordered the Montour Preserve, 2,600 acres of reclaimed land where I'd been conducting surveys. And because of something else, something they wanted me to verify. Donnelly played a recording on his phone. It was audio from a 911 call made the same night the trail camera activated. A man named Peter Schultz, calling from a campsite near Lake Chillisquaque, reporting that he and his girlfriend could hear singing in the woods. Not music from another campsite, he'd insisted. Something else. A woman's voice, high and clear, singing the same melody over and over. No words, just notes that rose and fell in a pattern that made them feel sick. Peter and his girlfriend, Alicia Brennan, had packed up their tent and tried to leave. They were found 3 hours later by fishermen wandering along Route 254 in opposite directions, 2 miles apart. Neither could remember leaving their campsite or where the other had gone. Both were barefoot despite hiking through briars and over gravel roads. Neither had a scratch on their feet. When questioned separately, they both described the same thing. They'd followed the singing deeper into the woods, unable to stop themselves until they lost track of time and awareness. Peter remembered seeing a woman in a white dress standing among the trees. Alicia remembered the woman opening her mouth wide enough to reveal something moving inside, something that writhed and glistened. Then nothing until they found themselves on the roadside at dawn. The connection to Judith Reardon was this. She'd been reported missing by her husband after she went for an evening walk near their home on the outskirts of Millville. She'd left at sunset, never returned. Her phone was found on a trail near the preserve, battery dead, last location ping placing her less than a mile from where the trail camera had captured her image. But Judith had been missing for 3 days when that camera activated, and her autopsy, conducted after her body was found 4 days later, determined she'd been dead for at least 5 days. She'd been dead before the camera saw her. I agreed to help the state police search the area where Peter and Alicia had been camping. We assembled a team of 6, 2 troopers, 2 game commission officers, a search and rescue volunteer named Gary Hughes, and myself. We entered the woods near Lake Chillisquaque at dawn, equipped with GPS units and radios. The morning was cold, overcast, with fog hanging between the trees thick enough to limit visibility to about 30 yards. The preserve was mostly reclaimed strip mine land, reforested in the 70s with white pine and oak. The terrain was uneven, scarred by old mining operations, with sudden drop-offs and hidden depressions filled with stagnant water. We found Peter and Alicia's campsite within an hour. The tent was still there, collapsed and soaking wet. Their gear was scattered. Sleeping bags, cooking equipment, a cooler with food still inside. Everything left behind in apparent haste. Gary found the first strange thing. A circle of disturbed earth about 12 feet in diameter, maybe 40 yards from the campsite. The ground inside the circle was lower than the surrounding area by several inches, as if the soil had been compacted or had settled. No vegetation grew within the circle, despite thick ground cover everywhere else. The soil was gray, almost ash-like, and when Gary knelt to touch it, he jerked his hand back immediately. "It's warm," he said. I knelt beside him and confirmed it. The ground was warm to the touch, maybe 80 degrees, despite the ambient temperature being in the low 40s. There was no logical explanation for it. No underground spring, no decomposing organic matter, nothing. We found 3 more circles over the next 2 hours, each identical in size and temperature, arranged in a rough line leading deeper into the preserve. Then we heard the singing. It started faint, distant, somewhere to the northeast. A woman's voice, high and pure, carrying through the fog with unnatural clarity. The melody was simple, repetitive, rising and falling in a pattern that reminded me of a lullaby. But there were no words, just vocalization that felt both beautiful and deeply wrong. Trooper Donnelly radioed for us to stay together and move toward the sound. We walked in a tight group, following the singing deeper into the woods. The fog grew thicker. The trees seemed to close in around us. I noticed we were moving downhill into one of the old strip mine cuts. The vegetation changed. Fewer mature trees, more briars and sumac. The ground became softer, wetter. The singing grew louder. Then it multiplied. What had been one voice became 2, then 3, then more. Multiple women's voices, all singing the same melody in perfect harmony, surrounding us from every direction. The sound was so clear and close that I expected to see the singers emerge from the fog at any moment. Gary stopped walking. "We need to leave," he said. His voice was shaking. Donnelly agreed. He radioed dispatch to report our position and request backup. But his radio produced only static. All our radios did. The GPS units showed our location flickering. jumping between coordinates that placed us miles apart. One of the Game Commission officers, a man named Dale Fitzroy, suddenly walked away from the group. He moved quickly, purposefully, heading toward the densest concentration of singing. We shouted for him to stop, but he didn't acknowledge us. He just walked into the fog and disappeared. We ran after him, found him 30 seconds later, standing in another circle of warm gray earth, staring at something we couldn't see. His eyes were open but unfocused, his mouth slightly parted. When Donnelly grabbed his shoulder, Dale didn't respond. He was breathing, blinking, but utterly unresponsive. That's when I saw her, a woman in a white dress, standing at the edge of the circle maybe 15 feet away. She was facing us, her features obscured by fog, her dress hanging limp and wet as if she'd just emerged from water. Her mouth was open, and the singing was coming from her, but her mouth wasn't moving. The sound just poured out, impossibly loud, impossibly clear. Then she took a step forward, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. It was Judith Reardon. I recognized her from the photograph her husband had provided to police, but her skin was gray, her eyes clouded white, and her jaw hung open far wider than any living person's could, stretched to the point where I could see the entire inside of her mouth and throat. And there were things moving inside her throat, small pale shapes that writhed and crawled over each other. The singing stopped. Judith's body collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. She fell forward into the circle, and the moment she hit the ground, the fog around us seemed to rush inward, converging on the circle. I felt a pulling sensation, as if the air itself were being drawn toward where Judith lay. Trooper Donnelly grabbed Dale and dragged him backward. We all ran. I don't know how we found our way out. The fog was too thick, the terrain too confusing. But somehow we emerged onto a fire road near the lake 40 minutes later. All of us, except Dale, who remained catatonic and had to be carried. When search and rescue teams went back with cadaver dogs that afternoon, they found Judith Reardon's body in the circle where we'd seen her. The coroner confirmed she'd been dead for at least 6 days. Her mouth showed signs of severe trauma, as if her jaw had been forcibly dislocated. Her throat contained traces of a substance that lab tests couldn't identify. Something organic, but not human, not animal, nothing in their database. Dale Fitzroy recovered after 3 days in the hospital. He had no memory of walking away from the group or what he'd seen in the circle. He resigned from the Game Commission the following week. Peter Schultz and Alicia Brennan left Pennsylvania. They wouldn't speak to investigators beyond their initial statements. The preserve remains open to the public. The state police closed the case, attributing Judith's death to misadventure and hypothermia, though they couldn't explain the trail camera images or the physical evidence in the circles. I've been back to the preserve for work. I have to be. It's my job. But I never go alone anymore. And I never go near the areas where we found those circles. Because sometimes, on cold mornings when the fog is thick, I can still hear the singing, faint and distant, carrying through the trees, and I know that if I followed it, I'd find another circle of warm gray earth, and another woman in a white dress, standing with her mouth stretched open. I know I'd walk toward her, unable to stop myself, and she'd sing me down into that place where Judith went. They never found where Judith had been for those 3 days before her body appeared on the trail camera. The coroner said her stomach was empty. Her body showed signs of severe dehydration, but there was no evidence of restraint or imprisonment. She'd been somewhere, doing something for 72 hours, and whatever that place was, it sent her back to sing. If you hear singing in the woods and there's no source you can see, turn around. Walk away, run if you have to. Some voices aren't meant to be followed. The envelope arrived at the sheriff's office with no return address, and inside were photographs of crimes that hadn't happened yet. I was sorting mail at the front desk when Sheriff Patterson opened the manila envelope. 5 photographs spilled onto her desk. 4x6 prints on glossy paper, the kind you'd get developed at a pharmacy. She picked up the first one, frowned, and then went very still in a way that made me stop what I was doing and watch. "Beth," she said quietly, "look at this." The photograph showed a living room. A man sat in a recliner, facing a television that wasn't on. His head was tilted back at an unnatural angle, and there was a darkness spreading across the carpet beneath the chair. The image was slightly blurry, as if the photographer's hand had been shaking, but clear enough to see details. The floral wallpaper, the cross-stitch sampler on the wall, the stack of Reader's Digest on a side table. Sheriff Patterson recognized the living room. It belonged to Arnold Kowalski, a 73-year-old retiree who lived alone on Brestoria Road outside Windridge. She'd been to his house twice before on wellness checks requested by his daughter. "My name is Beth Linderman. I'm 28 years old, and I'd been working as an administrative assistant for the Greene County Sheriff's Office for 4 years when the envelope arrived. Windridge is a tiny community in the far southwest corner of Pennsylvania, maybe 300 people, most of them connected to the natural gas industry or farming. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and serious crime is rare enough to make the Pittsburgh news when it happens." Sheriff Patterson called Deputy Morrison and told him to drive out to Arnold's house for a welfare check. Then she looked at the other 4 photographs. The second photo showed a kitchen. A woman stood at the sink with her back to the camera, washing dishes. Nothing appeared wrong with the image at first glance, but when Patterson examined it more closely, she saw the reflection in the window above the sink. Someone standing behind the woman, arms raised, holding what looked like a length of pipe or a bat. The third photo showed a car parked on a dark road. The driver's door was open. No one visible in the frame, but there were objects on the ground beside the car that looked like scattered groceries. The fourth photo showed a basement. Concrete walls, exposed pipes, a water heater in the corner, and on the floor a tarp covering something large and human-shaped. The fifth photo showed the exterior of a white church with a small cemetery beside it. Nighttime shot. The church door stood open, light spilling out, and in the cemetery, between the headstones, were shapes that might have been people. Might have been. Deputy Morrison radioed back 20 minutes later. Arnold Kowalski was dead. The deputy found him in his living room, sitting in his recliner, head tilted back, carpet soaked with blood. Exactly like the photograph. The coroner determined Arnold had been dead for approximately 8 to 12 hours when Morrison found him. He'd suffered a massive stroke, natural causes, no sign of foul play, but the photograph had been mailed. It had a postmark from 2 days earlier, which meant someone had taken that picture at least 48 hours before Morrison arrived. Someone had been in Arnold's house, photographing his corpse, and then mailed the image to the sheriff's office. Unless the photograph showed Arnold before he died, which was impossible given the blood and his obvious deceased state in the image. Sheriff Patterson sealed the other photographs as evidence and called the state police. She didn't tell anyone except Morrison and me what they showed, but she did start making quiet inquiries about the locations. The kitchen in the second photo belonged to Margaret Doyle, a 62-year-old woman who lived with her adult son, Clifton, on a property near Brock Road. Patterson drove out there personally that same afternoon, claiming she wanted to discuss a community safety initiative. Margaret was alive and fine. Her kitchen looked exactly like the photograph. Same yellow curtains, same ceramic rooster on the windowsill. When Patterson asked if anyone had been taking pictures around her property, Margaret said no. She lived alone with Clifton, who worked night shifts at the gas compressor station. No visitors, no photographers. Patterson advised her to keep her doors locked and call immediately if she saw anyone suspicious. She didn't mention the photograph. 3 days later, Margaret Doyle was murdered. Clifton found her when he came home from work at 6 in the morning. She'd been struck repeatedly with a piece of rebar from the barn. The killer had approached her while she washed dishes at the kitchen sink. She never saw it coming. Clifton was arrested within hours. He confessed. Said he'd been arguing with his mother about money, about the property, about his drinking. Said something snapped. He described hitting her from behind while she stood at the sink, exactly as the photograph had shown, but Clifton couldn't explain how anyone had photographed the moment before it happened. He insisted no one else had been present. There were no cameras in the house, no security system, no neighbors with a view of the kitchen. The photograph had captured an event that occurred 3 days after the image was mailed. Sheriff Patterson sent the remaining 3 photographs to the State Police Forensic Lab and requested FBI involvement. The prints showed no fingerprints, no DNA, no identifying marks. The photo paper was a common brand sold at every Walmart and drugstore in 3 states. The envelope's postmark was from the Windridge Post Office, but the clerk who worked there couldn't remember who'd mailed it. Patterson assigned deputies to locate the other scenes in the photographs. The car on the dark road was identified as a stretch of Route 218 near Gray's Landing. The basement appeared to match several dozen properties in the area. The white church was almost certainly Windridge United Methodist, the only church in the immediate area with that specific architecture. Nothing had happened at those locations yet, but everyone understood what "yet" meant. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd worked in law enforcement administration long enough to see crime scene photos, case files, autopsy reports. But these were different. These felt like warnings or predictions. Or something worse. Documentation of events that were always going to happen, that couldn't be prevented, that someone or something was recording before they occurred. 2 weeks passed. Nothing happened at the church or on Route 218. The deputies increased patrols. Pastor Kenneth Haywood, who led the Methodist congregation, was informed about the photograph and advised to install security cameras and motion lights. He complied, though he seemed skeptical that anything would happen. Then a man named Travis Cutter disappeared. He'd been driving home from his shift at the drilling site near Ryerson Station State Park when he stopped for gas in Windridge. Security cameras at the gas station showed him filling his truck at 9:30 p.m., then driving off. He never made it home to Mount Morris. His truck was found on Route 218. Driver's door open, groceries scattered on the ground beside it. Exactly like the third photograph. There was blood on the driver's seat. Not much, but enough to indicate injury. Cadaver dogs tracked a scent into the woods bordering the road, then lost it near a creek. Despite extensive searches, Travis Cutter was never found. His wife told investigators that Travis had been worried lately. He'd mentioned seeing someone watching him from the tree line near the drilling site. Someone who stood completely still for hours, never moving, just watching. When Travis approached, the figure would be gone. Other workers at the site confirmed they'd seen the same thing. A person, always at a distance, always motionless, always disappearing when approached. No one got close enough to see details. The fourth photograph showed someone knew where Travis was. The basement with the tarp-covered shape on the floor, but despite searching every abandoned property and basement within 20 miles, authorities found nothing. That left the church. Sheriff Patterson requested that services at Windridge United Methodist be suspended until the situation was resolved. Pastor Haywood refused. He said his congregation needed their faith now more than ever. That fear couldn't dictate their worship. Patterson stationed a deputy outside the church every Sunday and Wednesday night when services were held. Nothing happened for 6 weeks. Then, on a Thursday night in early December, Pastor Haywood called 911. He'd gone to the church to prepare for a memorial service the next day and found the door unlocked. He was certain he'd locked it that afternoon. When he stepped inside, he heard movement in the sanctuary. Someone was sitting in the pews. Multiple someones. He counted 7 figures, all sitting motionless in different rows, all facing the altar. None of them responded when he called out. He backed out of the church and called for help. Deputies arrived within 10 minutes. They entered the church with weapons drawn and found it empty. No people. No sign of forced entry. Nothing disturbed, except the collection plates. 7 of them removed from the cabinet in the vestibule and placed on the pews where the figures had been sitting. In each plate was a photograph. 7 new photographs. I saw them when they were brought into the office. Each one showed a different person, what appeared to be their final moments. A teenage girl in a bathtub, water dark around her. An elderly man lying in a hospital bed. Machines disconnected. A woman sitting in a car filled with exhaust fumes. A hunter collapsed in snow, rifle beside him. Each photograph captured death, or the moment before death, or something that would become death, and in the background of each image, barely visible, was the same figure. A person standing at a distance, watching, photographing. The figure was never clear enough to identify. Just a dark shape, human-sized, holding what might have been a camera. Sheriff Patterson shut down the investigation at that point. She boxed up all the photographs, sealed them with evidence tape, and sent them to the FBI field office in Pittsburgh with a request that Windridge be monitored for unusual activity. Then she stopped talking about it. The case remains open. None of the people in the new photographs have been identified. The FBI investigated for several months, found no leads, and filed it under unsolved. But people in Windridge know better. They know someone is out there with a camera, documenting things that haven't happened yet, or things that are always happening in some version of time we can't see. I left the sheriff's office last year. I couldn't work in that building anymore, looking at the mail every day, wondering if another envelope would arrive with my own photograph inside. Because here's what keeps me awake. The figure in the backgrounds of those images wasn't just watching. It was there, present, at the moment of each person's death or disappearance. Which means it wasn't predicting the future. It was making it happen. And it's still in Windridge, taking pictures. If you find a photograph of yourself that you don't remember being taken, especially one that shows you in a place or situation you haven't experienced yet, don't ignore it. Someone is documenting your ending, and they're getting closer. The sound started 3 weeks after they poured the concrete, and it came from 60 feet underground where nothing living should have been. I was standing in the pump house reviewing pressure gauges when I heard it for the first time. A rhythmic knocking, metal on metal, slow and deliberate. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. It echoed up through the water pipes that connected to the old mine shaft sealed 40 years earlier. I'd been working as a water treatment operator for the Coalport Municipal Authority for 7 months. The job was straightforward. Maintain the treatment facility, monitor the aquifer pumps, ensure the town's water supply stayed clean and consistent. Coalport is a small borough in Clearfield County, maybe 500 residents, most of them descendants of coal mining families from when the mines were still operational. My name is Dennis Fahey. I'm 52 years old. I grew up in Phillipsburg, 15 miles north, and I'd spent 30 years working in various municipal utility roles. I understood water systems. I understood old infrastructure. I understood how abandoned mines could create strange acoustic phenomena as they flooded and settled. But this wasn't settling. This was communication. The knocking continued for 90 seconds, then stopped. I documented it in my daily log, noting the time and duration, and I mentioned it to my supervisor, Carl Henning, when I filed my report that afternoon. He told me it was probably cavitation in the pipes, or maybe vibration from the main pump transferring through the system. He didn't seem concerned. The knocking came back the next night. Same time, 11:47 p.m. Same rhythm. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. I was alone in the facility doing the standard overnight check when I heard it. This time I traced the sound to the access pipe that connected our system to the old mine works. The mine beneath Coalport had been sealed in 1981 after the company that owned it went bankrupt. The shaft had flooded naturally over the decades, creating an underground reservoir that the town eventually tapped for supplemental water supply. The connection was made in 2003 through a controlled borehole that allowed pumps to access the flooded mine while keeping the actual shaft sealed. It was a common practice in coal country. Old mines became aquifers, but mine water is usually sterile. The depth, the darkness, the mineral content, nothing lives down there except bacteria. There shouldn't have been anything capable of making sound, let alone knocking in a pattern. I stood beside the access pipe and waited. The knocking came again. Clearer this time, louder, resonating through the metal. I pressed my hand against the pipe and felt it. Vibrations corresponding to each knock, as if something were striking the inside of the pipe from below. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. I radioed Carl despite the late hour, told him the situation wasn't normal, that we should shut down the mine pump and inspect the system. He said we'd look at it in the morning, that shutting down the pump overnight would create pressure issues for residents, and that I was probably just spooked by an old building's noises. But I knew better. I'd worked in enough old facilities to know the difference between ambient sound and intentional action. The knocking escalated over the following week. It began occurring multiple times per shift, sometimes at predictable intervals, sometimes randomly. The pattern changed too. 3 knocks became 5 knocks. 5 became 7. And then the rhythm began to vary, as if someone were experimenting with different sequences. On the 8th night, I heard something else. A voice. It was faint, distorted, carried through the water pipes like a degraded radio signal. Words I couldn't make out, but definitely human, definitely speech. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then cut off, replaced by the knocking. I reported it again. This time Carl agreed to come out. We stood together in the pump house at 2 in the morning, waiting. The knocking didn't come. We waited for an hour. Nothing. Carl suggested I take a few days off. He didn't say it directly, but I understood the implication. He thought I was stressed, hearing things, imagining problems. He assigned another operator, Terry Bowman, to cover my shifts while I rested. Terry called me on my 2nd day off. He'd heard the knocking, and more than that, he'd heard the voice clearly enough to make out words. "Help me." That's what it said, over and over. A man's voice, echoing through the pipes. "Help me, help me." Terry wanted to call the police. I convinced him to wait, to document everything first, to make sure we had evidence before making claims that would sound insane. We agreed to meet at the facility that night, both of us, to record the sounds together. We arrived at 10 p.m., set up digital recorders near the access pipe, and waited. The knocking started just after 11. 3 knocks, 5 knocks, 7 knocks, then a long pause. Then the voice came through, louder than I'd ever heard it. "Help me, I'm still here, I'm still here." Terry looked at me with something between terror and vindication. We had it on recording. Proof. "Where are you?" I called toward the pipe. The voice responded immediately. "Down here, in the shaft, in the water. I'm in the water." Terry backed away from the pipe. "This isn't possible," he said. I asked another question. "How long have you been down there?" Silence for nearly a minute. Then, "Since the sealing. They left me. They sealed it and left me here." 1981. The mine was sealed in 1981. That was 42 years ago. "Who are you?" I asked. Roy Kimmel." "Loader operator. They said everyone was out. They lied." Terry was already on his phone, searching. He found it in less than 2 minutes. An archived news article from the Clearfield Progress, dated October 1981. The article described the final closure of Coalport Mine No. 7. It mentioned that all workers had been accounted for and evacuated prior to the sealing. But in the comments section, someone had noted that a loader operator named Roy Kimmel had gone missing around the same time. His family claimed he'd been working in the mine the day before closure. The company insisted he'd been terminated weeks earlier and hadn't been on site. Roy Kimmel's disappearance was never officially connected to the mine. He was listed as a missing person, eventually presumed dead. No body ever found. "Roy," I said toward the pipe, "if you're down there, how have you survived?" The response was fragmented. Didn't survive, didn't survive. Water came in, cold, so cold. Took days, drowned in the dark. "Then what are we talking to?" Terry asked, though he directed the question at me, not the pipe. The voice answered anyway. "What's left? What doesn't leave?" "Stuck here. Can't get out. Water holds me. Concrete holds me. Mine holds me." The knocking resumed. Frantic this time, dozens of impacts against the pipe, rapid and chaotic, like something trying to break through. Terry and I left the pump house and called Carl. Told him everything, played him the recordings. To his credit, he didn't dismiss us. He contacted the State Department of Environmental Protection and requested an inspection of the mine access system. The DEP sent an engineer named Sandra Petrov. She reviewed the system, examined the access pipe, and ultimately recommended we lower a camera into the shaft to visually inspect the water source. The camera deployment happened 4 days later. A specialized water-resistant fiber optic system lowered down the access pipe on a spool of cable, descending 60 feet to where the pipe connected to the flooded mine shaft. The video feed showed exactly what you'd expect. Dark. The video feed showed exactly what you'd expect. Dark water. Suspended sediment, the concrete walls of the borehole descending into blackness. The camera reached the connection point, where our pipe met the flooded mine shaft, and Sandra adjusted the lighting to get a clearer view. That's when we saw the handprint. It was pressed against the inside of the access pipe, maybe 2 feet below the connection joint. A full palm print with fingers spread, stark white against the dark metal, as if someone had pressed their hand there with tremendous force. The skin appeared bleached, waterlogged, the flesh soft and deteriorating. Sandra pulled the camera back slightly to get a wider angle. There were more handprints, dozens of them, covering the inside of the pipe for several feet, all pressed outward as if someone had been trying to climb up from below. "Jesus Christ," Carl muttered. The camera continued descending into the mine shaft proper. The water was murky, visibility limited to about 6 feet even with the high-powered LED array. We could see the skeletal remains of old mining equipment, rusted rail tracks, support beams, the corroded frame of what might have been a coal cart. Then the camera found him. Roy Kimmel floated in the water about 15 feet below the access pipe. His body was suspended in the flooded shaft, arms spread, face turned upward toward the camera. The flesh had gone gray and soft from decades of water exposure, but the body hadn't decomposed the way it should have. Something about the water chemistry had preserved him, kept him intact in this horrible state between death and dissolution. His eyes were open. And as we watched the video feed, his mouth opened too. The knocking started again. We could hear it through the camera's audio feed, echoing through the water, and we could see it now. Roy's hands moving, striking against the metal pipe walls with slow, deliberate impacts. 3 knocks. 5 knocks. 7. "Turn it off," Terry said. "Pull the camera up. Turn it off." But Sandra kept recording. She had to. This was evidence of a workplace death, a corporate cover-up, a man left to die in a sealed mine. The camera needed to document everything. Roy's body began to move, not floating passively, but swimming. His arms pulled him through the water with slow, purposeful strokes, moving toward the camera. His eyes never blinked. His mouth remained open, and even through the distortion of the audio feed, we could hear the voice. "Help me, help me, let me out." The camera's light illuminated something behind Roy. More bodies, at least 3 others, floating in the darkness, suspended in the flooded shaft. They began to move too, all of them converging on the camera. Sandra yanked the cable, pulling the camera up rapidly. It ascended through the access pipe, past the handprints, up toward the surface. On the monitor, we watched the bodies follow, swimming upward through the water with unnatural speed. The camera emerged from the pipe and Sandra shut down the system immediately. We stood in silence in the pump house, staring at the access port, expecting something to emerge. Nothing did, but the knocking continued. Louder now, desperate. The entire pipe system vibrated with it, the sound resonating through the facility. Carl called the state police and the DEP headquarters. Within 6 hours, the site was swarmed with investigators, environmental specialists, and forensic teams. The access pipe was sealed with a concrete plug. The pump system was permanently shut down. The town was switched to an emergency water supply trucked in from Phillipsburg. The decision was made not to attempt recovery of the bodies. The mine shaft was too deep, too unstable, too dangerous. And there was the question of what, exactly, would be recovered. The bodies in that water weren't behaving like bodies. They were animate, aware, trapped in some state between death and existence, a state the water was sustaining. The DEP investigation uncovered the truth. In October 1981, the mining company had sealed the shaft ahead of schedule, claiming financial insolvency required immediate closure. 4 workers had been underground when the sealing began. Roy Kimmel, Patrick Hess, Darren Luttrell, and James Cordova. All 4 were reported as having left the site or been terminated. All 4 families filed missing person reports. None of the reports were connected to the mine closure because the company insisted no one had been left behind. The water had flooded the sealed shaft over a period of 3 to 5 days, long enough for anyone trapped inside to drown slowly in the rising darkness. The case was referred to the State Attorney General for potential criminal prosecution, but everyone involved with the 1981 closure was either deceased or untraceable. The mining company had dissolved decades ago. There was no one left to charge. The access pipe remained sealed. The mine beneath Coalport is officially designated as hazardous and off-limits. The town installed a new water system connected to a surface reservoir. But the knocking hasn't stopped. Residents living near the old mine site report hearing it on quiet nights. Rhythmic knocking coming from the ground, from basement walls, from water pipes. 3 knocks, 5 knocks, 7. And sometimes, late at night, voices echoing up through drains and toilets. "Help me, I'm still here." I left Coalport. I couldn't work there anymore. Couldn't live in a town where 4 men were drowning over and over in the darkness below, trapped in water that wouldn't let them die, wouldn't let them rest. The official report states the bodies are irretrievable, but I know the truth. They don't want to be retrieved. They want to be freed. They want to climb up through those pipes and emerge into the light. And someday, someone will open the wrong valve or break the wrong seal, and they'll get their chance. If you live above old mine works, pay attention to your water. If you hear knocking in your pipes, if you hear voices in your drains, if your water tastes different than it should, call someone. Don't drink it. Don't bathe in it. Don't let it touch you. Because some water remembers what drowned in it, and it's looking for a way out. The surveillance footage captured something impossible, and by the time the county mounted a response, 17 homes had been evacuated, and the National Guard had established a perimeter. I was reviewing security feeds from the high school when I noticed the figure standing at the edge of the parking lot. It appeared on camera 3, the one covering the north entrance, at 1:41 in the morning. A person, completely still, facing the building from approximately 50 yards away. At first, I assumed it was a student or a trespasser, but the figure didn't move. Not for 11 minutes. I watched the timestamp tick forward, and the figure remained absolutely motionless. No shift in posture, no movement of any kind. Just standing there, watching. My name is Lauren Pritchard. I'm 33 years old, and I'd been working as the security coordinator for the Tioga County School District for 2 years. Westfield is a rural borough in the northern part of the county, population around 1,100, surrounded by state forest and farmland. The school served students from Westfield and surrounding townships, maybe 400 kids total across all grades. We'd installed the surveillance system 6 months earlier after a series of break-ins at the elementary building. 8 cameras covering entrances and parking areas, motion-activated recording, feeds accessible remotely. Standard stuff. The system had worked perfectly until that night in late January. I continued watching camera 3. At 1:52, the figure finally moved, not walking away, but turning its head slowly to look at a different camera. Camera 5, which covered the east side of the building. And here's what made my stomach drop. The figure turned to face camera 5 before it activated. The motion sensor on that camera hadn't triggered yet, but the figure knew it was there, knew where it was positioned, and was looking directly at it. When camera 5 activated 3 seconds later, there was another figure standing in its field of view. Same posture, same complete stillness, this one closer to the building, maybe 30 yards away. I immediately called the Westfield Borough Police Department. At 1 in the morning on a Tuesday, that meant Officer Kyle Durant, the lone officer on overnight duty. I explained the situation, sent him screenshots from the feed, and he agreed to drive over and check the property. Kyle arrived at 2:07. I watched on the cameras as his patrol car pulled into the lot, spotlights sweeping across the grounds. The figure on camera 3 was gone. So was the one on camera 5. Kyle stepped out of his vehicle and began walking the perimeter with his flashlight. He moved past the locations where both figures had been standing. Nothing, no footprints in the snow, no sign anyone had been there. He radioed me directly. "Lauren, your camera's glitching, because I'm not seeing anyone out here." "They were there," I said. "Both of them, standing perfectly still for over 20 minutes. Kyle completed his sweep and left. He filed a report noting suspicious activity, but no evidence of trespassing or attempted entry. The figures returned the next night, 4 of them this time spread across different camera views, all facing the building, all motionless. They appeared between midnight and 2 a.m., standing in positions that gave them clear lines of sight to the school entrances, and they stayed until dawn. 6 hours of footage showing 4 figures standing in the cold, never moving, never leaving, just watching. I called Kyle again. He came out again. Again, nothing. No people, no tracks, no evidence. On the 3rd night, I watched the feeds live instead of reviewing recordings. I sat in my home office with all 8 camera views displayed on my monitors, waiting. The first figure appeared at 12:33 on camera 6, then another on camera 2 at 12:41, then 3 more over the next hour. By 2 a.m., there were 9 figures visible across 6 different cameras, forming a loose semicircle around the school building. I called Kyle and kept him on the phone while I watched. "They're there right now," I said. 9 of them. I'm looking at them on the feed. Kyle was already in his car, heading to the school. I tracked his arrival on camera 1. He pulled into the lot, spotlight active, and stepped out with his flashlight and radio. On my monitors, the figures remained visible. Kyle walked directly past 3 of them. He moved within 10 feet of one, close enough that his flashlight beam should have illuminated it clearly. But he saw nothing. He reported nothing. "Lauren, there's nobody here. Are you sure your system isn't malfunctioning?" I was sure. The figures were there on my screen, clear as day. Humanoid shapes, adult-sized, standing in the snow. I could see details. They wore dark clothing. Their postures suggested they were male. Their faces were turned toward the building, but Kyle couldn't see them, not with his eyes, not with his flashlight, not even when he stood directly beside one. I saved all the footage and contacted the security company that installed the system. They sent a technician the next morning. He tested every camera, every connection, every line of code in the software. The system was functioning perfectly. No glitches, no artifacts, no technical explanation for the figures. "Maybe it's infrared reflection," he suggested. "Sometimes cameras pick up heat signatures that aren't visible to the naked eye." But the figures weren't heat signatures. They had definition, shape, clothing, and they were visible on standard video, not thermal imaging. The technician left without an explanation. That night, the figures numbered 14. They stood closer to the building now, some within 20 feet of the entrances, and for the first time, one of them moved. The figure on camera 8 turned its head slowly and looked directly at the camera. Its face came into view, pale, expressionless, eyes that reflected the infrared illuminator like an animal's. Then it raised one arm and pointed at the camera. At me. I felt it, even though I was watching from 5 miles away, sitting in my home office. I felt the weight of that gesture, the accusation, the attention. I called Superintendent Morris at his home at 3 in the morning, told him everything. He authorized closing the school the next day while we figured out what was happening. He also contacted the Pennsylvania State Police and requested an investigation. 2 troopers arrived Wednesday afternoon. I showed them dozens of hours of footage. They watched the figures standing motionless, watched them multiply night after night, watched the one point at the camera. They took copies of everything and said they'd consult with their tech division. But they also did something I hadn't thought of. They searched property records for the land surrounding the school. The high school had been built in 1997 on a 20-acre parcel that had previously been farmland. But before that, going back to the 1930s, the land had been the site of the Westfield County Home, an almshouse for the poor, elderly, and mentally ill. The facility had operated for nearly 40 years before closing in 1972. The buildings were demolished in 1995 to make way for the school. The troopers found records indicating that the county home had buried its deceased residents in an unmarked cemetery on the property. At least 60 people over 4 decades, interred without headstones, without records of exact locations. When the school was built, no one had accounted for the cemetery. The construction crews had built directly over it. The school board ordered ground-penetrating radar surveys of the property. The scans revealed the extent of the problem: remains beneath the parking lot, beneath the athletic fields, beneath the building's foundation. Dozens of graves, disturbed and unrecorded. But that didn't explain the figures on the cameras. Dead people don't stand and watch. They don't point. They don't organize themselves in semicircles around buildings, unless they're not resting. The figures continued to appear every night, and their numbers grew. By the end of the second week, there were 31 visible on the cameras. They stood shoulder to shoulder now, forming a complete circle around the school. And they'd started appearing during the day too. Faint outlines visible on the daytime footage, transparent but present. Students and staff reported feeling watched. Cold spots in certain classrooms. Doors that wouldn't stay closed. Equipment malfunctions. Several teachers reported seeing movement in their peripheral vision. people standing at the edges of rooms who vanished when looked at directly. The superintendent closed the school permanently on February 12th. Students were redistributed to other buildings in the district. The facility was locked and secured, but the figures didn't leave. I continued monitoring the cameras remotely, and every night they were there. 31 people standing in the dark, surrounding an empty building, watching. The state police requested assistance from a parapsychology research team from Edinburgh University. I know how that sounds. But at that point, conventional investigation had yielded nothing useful. The team arrived in early March and spent 3 nights at the site with electromagnetic field meters, audio recorders, infrared cameras, and various other instruments. They recorded evidence, lots of it. Electromagnetic anomalies concentrated around the areas where remains had been detected. Temperature drops of 15 to 20 degrees in specific locations, and audio recordings that captured voices, multiple voices speaking over each other in what sounded like distress or confusion. The research team's report concluded that the site was experiencing sustained paranormal activity consistent with traumatic historical events and improper burial practices. They recommended the remains be properly exhumed and reinterred, that the site be blessed or cleansed according to appropriate religious or cultural protocols, and that the building be permanently closed. The school board accepted the recommendations. Over the course of 6 weeks, archaeologists and forensic specialists worked to recover remains from the property. They found 73 individuals, more than the records had indicated. The remains were transferred to a proper cemetery in Westfield, where a memorial stone was placed, acknowledging their identities and histories. The building was eventually demolished. The property remains vacant. It's officially designated as a memorial site now, though there are no plans to develop it. I still monitor the security cameras, even though the school no longer exists. The equipment was left in place to observe the site during the memorial period, and no one ever deactivated my access. The figures are still there. Not every night, not in the same numbers, but they're there. Standing on the empty lot where the building used to be, facing the spot where the entrance had been. Sometimes 3 or 4 of them, sometimes a dozen. But they're different now. They don't stand as close together. They don't form that tight circle. It's as if they're still present, still watching, but the urgency is gone. The anger or confusion or whatever it was that drove them has diminished. I think they're waiting to see if anyone remembers. If anyone cares, if the living acknowledge what happened to them. I left my position with the school district last year. Couldn't justify monitoring cameras that showed nothing but ghosts on an empty lot. But I still have the footage. Hundreds of hours of it, and sometimes I review it late at night, trying to understand what I witnessed. Because here's what I know. Those figures weren't trying to scare anyone. They weren't malevolent. They were just trying to be seen. For decades, they'd been buried without acknowledgement, without dignity, without anyone knowing they were there. And when the living built over their resting place, forgot they existed, moved through their space without remembering. They made themselves visible the only way they could, through cameras, through technology that could see what human eyes refused to. If you live near old institutions, almshouses, asylums, poorhouses, potters' fields, pay attention, not just to what you can see, but to what your cameras capture, to the cold spots in your basement, to the doors that won't stay closed, to the feeling of being watched. Because the forgotten dead don't always rest quietly. Sometimes they stand up and make sure you see them. And they'll wait as long as it takes for someone to acknowledge they were real. They mattered. They deserve to be remembered. The radio transmission interrupted every station in a 12-mile radius, and the voice that came through should have been dead for 30 years. I was driving north on Route 38 just past midnight when my truck's radio cut from classic rock to static, then to a voice I didn't recognize at first. Male, middle-aged, speaking with the measured cadence of a news broadcaster from a different era. This is station WCTP, Emlenton, Pennsylvania, broadcasting at 12:40 on your AM dial. The time is 11:47 p.m. and we have a severe weather alert for Venango County and surrounding areas. I glanced at my dashboard clock. It was 12:03. The voice was announcing a time from 16 minutes ago, and WCTP wasn't a call sign I recognized from any local station. My name is Graham Vesey. I'm 47 years old, and I work as a long-haul truck driver operating primarily throughout western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio. I'd been driving the Emlenton route for 8 years, hauling freight between Pittsburgh and Erie, and I knew every radio station between the two cities. WCTP wasn't one of them. The broadcast continued. The National Weather Service has issued a tornado warning for southern Venango County, including the boroughs of Emlenton, Clintonville, and surrounding townships. Residents are advised to seek shelter immediately in basements or interior rooms. This is not a test. I looked out my windshield. Clear night, stars visible, no wind, no storm activity of any kind. The broadcast was describing weather that wasn't happening. Then the voice said something that made me pull over. We've received reports of the storm damaging structures along Main Street. The Methodist Church has lost its steeple. Multiple homes have sustained roof damage. Emergency crews are responding, but roads are currently impassable due to debris. I knew Emlenton. Small town, maybe 600 people, situated along the Allegheny River. I'd stopped there dozens of times for fuel and food. The Methodist Church had lost its steeple. But that happened in 1994 during a severe storm that hit the region. I remembered it because the church had been condemned afterward and eventually demolished. The broadcast was describing an event from 30 years ago, as if it were happening now. I grabbed my phone and tried to search for information about WCTP. Before I could complete the search, the transmission changed. The voice was still speaking, but now it sounded strained, urgent. We're receiving reports of casualties, multiple injuries on Water Street. The storm has... Wait, we're getting conflicting information. Some residents are reporting that the damage occurred hours ago, but others are saying it's happening right now. Emergency dispatch is overwhelmed. If you can hear this broadcast, please stay indoors and await further instructions. Static consumed the transmission for several seconds. When the voice returned, it was different. Panicked. This is not a weather event. I repeat, this is not a weather event. Something is wrong with the timeline. Events are occurring out of sequence. The church steeple fell in 1994, but people are reporting it falling tonight. The bridge collapse on Route 38 happened in 1987, but there are cars in the water right now. I don't understand what's happening. If anyone is receiving this transmission, document everything. Time is... The broadcast cut off, replaced by normal radio programming. A commercial for a car dealership in Franklin. I sat in my truck on the shoulder of Route 38, trying to process what I'd just heard. I called the non-emergency number for Venango County Dispatch and asked if there were any weather emergencies or unusual incidents in Emlenton. The dispatcher said no, clear night, no storms, no emergencies, everything normal. I should have left it alone. Continued to Erie, made my delivery, pretended I'd imagined the broadcast or picked up some weird skip signal from a distant station, but I didn't. I turned around and drove back to Emlenton. The town was quiet when I arrived at 12:40. Main Street was empty. Streetlights illuminating closed businesses and dark storefronts. The Methodist Church, or the empty lot where it used to stand, was undisturbed. No damaged steeple because there was no church, but as I drove slowly down Main Street, I noticed something wrong. The buildings were wrong, not structurally, but temporally. The pharmacy on the corner had a sign that said Rexall Drug, a brand I hadn't seen in operation for 20 years. The car parked in front of the diner was a 1980s Chevrolet Cavalier, rust-free and clean, as if it were brand new. I stopped my truck and got out. The air was cold, still, normal. But the town felt suspended, caught between different periods. The diner's neon sign advertised breakfast special, $1.99, in a font and style from decades past. I walked to the diner's window and looked inside. Empty. But the tables were set, the counter had coffee cups arranged like customers had just left, and the clock on the wall showed 11:47 p.m., the same time the broadcast had announced. I heard it then. The radio transmission, but not through a speaker. Through the air itself, emanating from everywhere and nowhere. The same voice, continuing its emergency broadcast. Time is collapsing in Emlenton. Past events are manifesting in the present. The 1994 tornado, the 1987 bridge collapse, the 1973 flood. They're all happening simultaneously. Residents are experiencing multiple timelines. Some are living in 2024, others in 1994, others in 1987. They can't see each other, but they're occupying the same space. I looked down Main Street and saw movement. People appearing and disappearing like afterimages. A woman in a 1990s windbreaker running across the street, vanishing after 3 steps. A man in a 1980s-style suit standing beside a car that flickered in and out of existence. A child on a bicycle pedaling past, there for 2 seconds, then gone. They were ghosts or echoes, or people trapped in different moments of time, all layered on top of each other. The broadcast continued. I'm broadcasting from Studio C of the WCTP facility on River Road. The building is being affected too. I can see multiple versions of this room overlaid. Equipment from 1994, equipment from 1987, equipment that hasn't been installed yet. My producer is standing beside me, but when I look directly at him, he's gone. He's here in his time, but not in mine. I needed to find the station. River Road ran parallel to the Allegheny River on the west side of town. I got back in my truck and drove there, following the winding road past darkened homes and empty lots. The WCTP building appeared gradually, literally. As I drove closer, the structure seemed to flicker into solidity. One moment, an empty lot. The next, a single-story brick building with a small transmitter tower. The sign beside the road read, WCTP 1240 AM, your Valley Voice. The building's windows showed light inside. I parked and approached on foot. Through the front window, I could see a broadcast studio. Vintage equipment, microphones, turntables, a control board with analog meters, and a man sitting at the desk, speaking into a microphone. He was in his 50s, wearing a dress shirt and tie, headphones around his neck. As I watched, he flickered. There, then translucent, then there again. He was unstable, existing in some state between solid and ethereal. I opened the door and stepped inside. The man looked up, startled, his eyes widening when he saw me. "You can see me," he said. "Yes, I heard your broadcast. I came to..." I didn't know how to finish that sentence. To help, to understand, to verify I wasn't insane. "What year is it?" he asked. 2024, January. He closed his eyes. "It's been 30 years. I've been broadcasting for 30 years. His name was Martin Schaefer. He'd been the station manager and primary announcer for WCTP in 1994 when the tornado hit Emlenton. The station had been damaged in the storm, transmitter knocked offline, building partially destroyed. Martin had been broadcasting emergency information when the building was struck. He died in the collapse. But he hadn't stopped broadcasting. "I don't know what happened," Martin said. "The tornado hit at 11:47 p.m. on March 15, 1994. I was on air, giving warnings, and then everything went white. When I could see again, I was still here in the studio, still broadcasting, but something was wrong. The equipment kept changing, the room kept changing. I'd see different versions of this building from different years all layered together. He explained that he'd continued broadcasting because he didn't know what else to do. He'd maintained the emergency alert for hours, then days, then years. At some point, he realized that time in Emlenton was broken. Past events kept bleeding through into the present. The 1994 tornado would recur. The 1987 bridge collapse would replay. The 1973 flood would manifest in dry weather. It started small, Martin said. Objects appearing that shouldn't exist. People reporting déjà vu so intense they couldn't function. Then the manifestations became more frequent, past and present occupying the same space. And I kept broadcasting, trying to warn people, trying to document what was happening. I asked if anyone else could hear him. He said sometimes. Occasionally someone would respond, would find the station, would see him briefly before the building flickered out of existence. But most people couldn't perceive what was happening. They'd experience the temporal anomalies without understanding them. Why is this happening to Emlenton? I asked. Martin didn't know, but he had theories. The town was built on a convergence point, literally. 3 rivers met near Emlenton, 3 railroad lines crossed, 3 major roads intersected. And beneath the town, old oil wells from the 1800s penetrated deep into the earth, some of them abandoned, some of them still leaking. The combination of geographic convergence and industrial scarring might have created some kind of instability. Or maybe it was just random. Maybe Emlenton was unlucky. Maybe time has weak spots, places where the membrane between past and present grows thin, and certain events can rupture it. Can it be fixed? I asked. Martin shook his head. I've been trying for 30 years. It only gets worse. More events bleeding through. More people caught between timelines. The town is dying because no one can live here anymore. People move away, businesses close, and the only ones who stay are the ones who don't realize they're living in multiple eras simultaneously. He told me to leave, to drive away and forget about Emlenton. To warn anyone I could that the town was unstable, dangerous, that time itself was broken there. I left. I got in my truck and drove back to Route 38 and continued to Erie. I completed my delivery, filed my logs, and tried to forget what I'd seen. But I've been back to Emlenton 3 times since that night. Each time, the temporal anomalies are more visible. Buildings flicker between architectural styles from different decades. Cars on Main Street are from the 1990s, the 1980s, the 1970s. People walk through each other, oblivious, existing in different layers of time. And every night at 11:47 p.m., Martin Schaefer broadcasts his emergency alert. I can hear it on my truck's radio if I'm within 12 miles. The same voice, the same warning, echoing across 3 decades. The town's population has dropped to fewer than 200 residents. Most are elderly, people who've lived there so long they don't notice the changes. Or maybe they're not even from this timeline. Maybe they're echoes from past eras, trapped and repeating. I reported everything to the state police, to the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, to anyone who would listen. They've investigated, they've documented the anomalies. But there's no protocol for temporal instability, no agency equipped to handle a town that exists in multiple time periods simultaneously. So Emlenton continues to deteriorate. The buildings crumble because they're experiencing years of weathering in compressed time. The roads crack because they're being used by traffic for multiple decades, and Martin Schaefer keeps broadcasting. A voice from 1994 warning people in 2024 about a storm that never ends. If you're driving through Venango County and your radio picks up a station that shouldn't exist, broadcasting from a time that's already passed, don't go looking for the source. Don't try to help. Some places are beyond help. Some places have fallen out of time entirely, and anyone who enters risks being trapped there, caught in the collapse, existing forever in a moment that never resolves. Martin Schaefer has been broadcasting for 30 years. He'll be broadcasting for 30 more, and eventually he'll be broadcasting to a town that no longer exists in any timeline, a ghost warning ghosts about a storm that happened, is happening, and will always be happening. Turn off your radio and drive past. Some signals aren't meant to be followed. The first time someone reported seeing figures in the abandoned school, it was dismissed as teenagers exploring. By the time the pattern became clear, 43 different people had witnessed the same impossible thing. I was photographing the exterior of the old high school building for a historic preservation survey when I saw movement in one of the third-floor windows. A face, pressed against the glass, watching me. The building had been empty for 6 years. My name is Jennifer Cassidy. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a freelance architectural photographer and historical documentation specialist. I'd been hired by the Huntingdon County Historical Society to photograph 12 abandoned structures scheduled for potential demolition, and the Orbisonia Rock Hill High School was third on my list. The school had closed in 2018 when the district consolidated with a neighboring system, and the building had sat vacant ever since. Orbisonia is a small borough in the southern part of Huntingdon County. Population maybe 400, known primarily for the East Broad Top Railroad, a historic narrow-gauge line that's a tourist attraction. The town itself is quiet, economically depressed, with a main street that has more empty storefronts than operating businesses. The school building, a 3-story brick structure built in 1936, dominated the town's skyline, visible from everywhere. I lowered my camera and stared at the third-floor window. The face was gone, but I'd seen it clearly enough to note details. Pale, adult-sized, positioned as if someone were kneeling or crouching to look down at me. I walked around to the front entrance and tried the doors, locked, secured with chains and padlocks. The windows on the ground floor were boarded up. There was no obvious way inside, no signs of forced entry. I called the borough office and asked if anyone had authorization to be in the building. The clerk, a woman named Patricia Donovan, said no. The building was sealed. No maintenance, no inspections, no access granted to anyone. She asked if I had seen someone inside. I hesitated. Maybe, or a reflection. Patricia sighed. You're not the first person to report seeing things in that building. We've had police check it multiple times, always empty. She explained that over the past year, numerous residents had reported seeing figures in the school's windows. Sometimes one, sometimes several, always during daylight hours. The police had investigated each report, entering the building and searching all 3 floors. They'd never found evidence of trespassing or occupation. Could be vandals getting in and out somehow, Patricia said, or people's imaginations. That building's been part of this town for almost 90 years. People have memories attached to it. Sometimes they see what they expect to see. I thanked her and returned to photographing the exterior. I completed my shots over the next 90 minutes, documenting the building from multiple angles. During that time, I saw the figure 3 more times, twice in third-floor windows, once in a second-floor window. Each time, by the time I raised my camera to photograph it, the figure had moved away from the glass. I reviewed my photos that evening in my hotel room in Huntingdon. In 3 of the images, barely visible through the dirty windows, were shapes that might have been people. Indistinct, blurry, but present. I contacted the Historical Society and reported what I'd seen. The director, Dr. Raymond Keller, asked if I'd be willing to photograph the building's interior as well. He secured permission from the borough, and a week later I returned to Orbisonia with a police escort to access the building. Officer Christopher Boyd unlocked the chains and opened the front entrance. The smell that emerged was overwhelming. Mildew, rot, decay, and something else. Something organic and wrong, like meat left to spoil in a closed space. Jesus, Officer Boyd muttered, covering his nose. That's new. Didn't smell like this last time I checked the building. We entered cautiously. The front hallway was dark despite the afternoon sunlight outside. My flashlight revealed what you'd expect in an abandoned school. Peeling paint, water damage, debris scattered on the floor. Old lockers lined the walls, doors hanging open. Bulletin boards still displayed faded announcements from 2018. We moved deeper into the building, checking classrooms on the first floor. All empty. Desks and chairs stacked haphazardly, chalkboards covered in dust. No sign of recent human presence. No footprints in the dust, no graffiti, no trash. But the smell intensified as we ascended to the second floor. Officer Boyd radioed for backup, concerned that we might find a deceased animal or even a human body. The second floor was darker. The windows here were less damaged, letting in less light, and the hallway stretched into shadows that my flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. We checked classrooms methodically. Empty. All of them empty. Except the biology lab. When Officer Boyd opened that door, we both stopped. The room was arranged, deliberately, intentionally arranged. Desks in perfect rows, lab equipment positioned on tables as if class were about to begin. The chalkboard had writing on it, a lesson plan for cellular mitosis, written in neat handwriting, the chalk fresh enough that it hadn't faded. "Someone's been in here," Boyd said. He drew his weapon and radioed for immediate backup. We backed out of the room and waited in the hallway. 2 more officers arrived within 10 minutes, and together they searched the entire second floor. No one found. No explanation for the arranged classroom. One of the officers, a woman named Sandra Hare, discovered something else in a classroom at the end of the hall. Desks arranged in rows, books open on them, writing on the chalkboard. But the books were from 2018. Textbooks that should have been removed when the school closed, and the writing on the board was dated October 12, 2018. That was the last day of classes before the school closed. We went to the 3rd floor. That's where we found all of them. The 3rd floor had been used for administrative offices, the library, and a large assembly hall. When we entered the assembly hall, we found over 100 desks arranged in rows facing the stage. And sitting at every desk was a figure. Not people, not exactly. Shapes that resembled people. Adult-sized, hunched over the desks, absolutely still. They were made of something dark and organic, like shadows given substance. No faces, no clothing, just humanoid forms that absorbed light. Officer Boyd shouted for them to identify themselves. None moved. He approached the nearest figure, and when he touched it, the form collapsed. It fell apart into what looked like ash and dust and something wet. The smell became unbearable. All at once, every figure in the room collapsed, over 100 shapes dissolving simultaneously into piles of organic matter that covered the floor. We ran. We evacuated the building immediately. An Officer Boyd called the state police and requested a hazmat team. Within hours, the school was cordoned off and specialists in protective gear entered to investigate. Their findings were disturbing. The substance that composed the figures was biological, human tissue in an advanced state of decay, but structured in a way that was impossible. The material had been shaped, molded, animated somehow. DNA testing revealed fragments from multiple individuals, dozens of people, all present in each collapsed form. No explanation for how the material had been assembled or animated. No explanation for why it was arranged in classroom settings. No explanation for the figures that had been seen in the windows for months. But here's what made it worse. The school's library had records. Attendance logs, yearbooks, enrollment files from decades of operation. The state police cross-referenced the DNA findings with the records. Every DNA sample matched students or staff who had attended the school between 1936 and 2018. People who were still alive, living in Pennsylvania and surrounding states. Their genetic material was somehow present in the building, shaped into those forms, arranged in classrooms as if attending lessons. Phone calls were made to dozens of individuals whose DNA had been identified. All confirmed they were alive, healthy, unaware of anything unusual. None reported missing tissue or biological samples. None had been to Orbisonia in years. Yet parts of them had been in that school, arranged in those figures. The building was sealed permanently. The borough condemned it, and plans for demolition were accelerated. But before the demolition could proceed, the figures returned. Residents reported seeing them in the windows again, shapes moving through the classrooms, sitting at desks, standing in hallways. The police refused to enter the building again. Private security was hired to monitor the exterior. The security footage captured what happened next. Over a period of 3 weeks, the figures began to leave the building, not through doors or windows, but through the walls themselves. They'd appear in the windows, then pass through the brick and glass as if it were mist, emerging onto the school grounds. Once outside, they'd walk into town. People reported seeing them on Main Street, in front of homes, standing in yards. Always motionless, always silent, always dissolving into ash after several minutes. The town's population began to decline rapidly. Families moved away, businesses closed. The borough council held emergency meetings but had no solutions. What do you do when your town is being haunted by pieces of people who are still alive? Dr. Keller, the Historical Society director, developed a theory. He believed the school building had somehow absorbed genetic material from everyone who'd occupied it over 82 years. Hair, skin cells, blood, saliva. All the biological debris humans shed constantly. The building had collected it, held it, and something had animated it. Maybe it was intentional. Maybe some past administrator or janitor or student had been involved in occult practices, had used the building for rituals, had bound something to the structure. Or maybe it was accidental. Maybe decades of human presence in one location created an imprint, and when the building was abandoned, that imprint tried to recreate what had been lost. The school was demolished in August. Crews worked quickly, reducing the building to rubble over 4 days. The debris was transported to a landfill outside the county, scattered and buried. The figures stopped appearing after the demolition. The sightings ended. Orbisonia began to recover slowly, though the population never returned to previous levels. But people whose DNA was found in those figures report something strange. They dream about the school. All of them, regardless of when they attended or what their relationship to the building was. They dream they're sitting in classrooms, unable to move, watching lessons that never end. They dream of being assembled from dust and ash, shaped into forms made to occupy spaces they left decades ago. And they wake up with the smell of that building in their nostrils, mildew and rot and decay. I completed my photographic survey of the other 11 buildings on the Historical Society's list. None showed anything unusual, but I've never forgotten the Orbisonia School. Never forgotten those figures sitting in rows, hunched over desks in a building that should have been empty. Because here's what I think. They weren't haunting the school, they were attending it. Whatever animated those forms was trying to recreate the purpose of the building. Education, structure, routine. It was trying to fill the empty classrooms with students, even if those students were made of cast-off genetic material and shadow. The building wanted to be a school again, and when it couldn't have living students, it made its own. If you've ever attended a school that's since been abandoned, pay attention to your dreams. Pay attention to any mail from your old district. Pay attention to the feeling that somewhere, in a place you left behind, a piece of you is still sitting at a desk, waiting for a lesson that will never end. Because buildings remember, and sometimes they refuse to let go. The recording equipment captured audio that shouldn't exist, and when we played it back, 3 people in the room stopped breathing. I was testing a new setup for wildlife audio monitoring when the microphones picked up something that made me check the equipment twice. Human voices, clear and distinct, speaking in the middle of the Susquehannock State Forest where no humans should have been for miles. My name is Eric Tolliver. I'm 34 years old, and I work as an acoustic ecologist studying soundscape patterns in Pennsylvania's northern forests. I record environmental audio to track animal populations, forest health, and the impact of human activity on natural habitats. I'd been placing autonomous recording units throughout Potter County for 2 years, gathering data for a long-term research project in collaboration with Penn State. The recording in question came from a unit I'd installed 3 miles northwest of Shingle House, mounted in a tree at about 15 feet elevation. The unit ran continuously, recording 30-second clips every 10 minutes, 24 hours a day. When I retrieved the SD card after a 2-week deployment, I noticed one clip file was significantly larger than the others, indicating it had captured more complex audio. I played it back in my field station, a small cabin I rented outside Kudasport. The first 7 seconds were typical forest sounds: wind, distant bird calls, rustling leaves. Then voices emerged. "Please, we don't have much time." I know, just tell me where." "Beneath the foundation." He buried them beneath the foundation before the concrete was poured. "How many?" 4, maybe 5. I couldn't count. There was so much blood. The voices were male, urgent, speaking quickly as if afraid of being overheard. The audio quality was remarkably clear, clearer than any wildlife recording I'd ever captured. I could hear breathing, the scrape of fabric, even the subtle shifts in position as the speakers moved. Then another voice, younger, panicked. "He's coming back. We have to go, now." Footsteps. Running. And then a sound like thunder or an explosion, low and rumbling, followed by screaming that lasted 3 seconds before cutting off abruptly. The audio file ended. Total duration, 48 seconds. I checked the timestamp. The recording was made at 3:37 a.m. 6 days earlier. I'd been asleep in my cabin 30 miles away when it was captured. I played the clip for my research partner, Dr. Samantha Keene, a wildlife biologist from the university. She listened twice, frowning. "That's not wildlife," she said. "That's people having a conversation in the middle of the forest in the middle of the night." "Exactly. But there's no hiking trail within 2 miles of that recorder. No campgrounds, no reason for anyone to be there. Unless they were doing something they didn't want to be seen doing." I contacted the Pennsylvania State Police and played the recording for Trooper Michael Del Vecchio. He listened, made notes, and asked for the exact coordinates of the recording unit. I provided them, and he said he'd investigate. 3 days later, Trooper Del Vecchio called me. We searched the area. Didn't find any evidence of recent human activity. No footprints, no disturbed ground, no signs of digging or burial. Whatever you recorded, it didn't leave physical evidence. You think it's fake? Like someone playing a prank? I think it's strange, but without evidence of a crime, there's not much we can do. He suggested I continue monitoring the location to see if the voices returned. I agreed, and I reinstalled the recording unit in the same tree, this time with higher sensitivity settings. The voices returned 6 days later. Different conversation, same location, same time, 3:37 a.m. It's happening again, just like before. How many this time? 3. Young ones. He's getting bolder. We have to stop him. We have to... Static consumed the audio, then silence. I retrieved the recording unit the next morning and noticed something odd. The tree where the unit was mounted showed damage that hadn't been there before. 3 deep gouges in the bark, parallel, running vertically from about 6 feet up to the ground. Like claw marks, but larger than any animal in the region could produce. I photographed the marks and sent the images to Samantha. She couldn't identify the source. Bears don't create marks like that. Neither do cougars, which are rare in the area anyway. I reinstalled the unit on a different tree 50 yards away and added a trail camera pointing at the original tree. If something was creating those marks, I wanted to see it. The camera captured it. At 3:36 a.m., the camera activated. The infrared showed the forest, the original tree, normal surroundings. Then figures appeared, not walking into frame, but appearing. 3 of them, humanoid, standing around the base of the tree. They were indistinct, translucent, like shadows given partial form. They stood motionless for 30 seconds. Then one of them turned its head and looked directly at the camera. Even through the infrared, I could see something was wrong with its face. Too long, features stretched, eyes too large. The figure raised an arm and pointed at the camera. The video feed distorted, breaking into digital artifacts, then went black. When the camera reactivated 7 minutes later, the figures were gone. The audio recording from that night captured voices again, but this time they were different. Angry, accusatory. Why are you listening? Why are you watching? This isn't for you. This isn't your time. Leave. Leave before he knows you're here. Then that same thunder-like sound, followed by silence. I showed all the evidence to Trooper Del Vecchio. He involved the state police's criminal investigation division, and a team of 4 investigators accompanied me to the site. We hiked in during daylight, equipped with metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and excavation tools. The radar showed anomalies. Beneath the soil, approximately 8 feet down, were objects that produced signatures consistent with dense organic material, possibly bone, possibly human. The investigators obtained a warrant and began excavation. Over 2 days, working carefully, they uncovered remains. 4 sets of human remains buried in a rough pit, wrapped in deteriorated canvas or burlap. Forensic examination determined the remains were old, at least 60 years, possibly more. 3 were children or teenagers. 1 was an adult female. DNA analysis eventually identified 2 of the victims. They had been reported missing in 1957 and 1959 from communities in Potter County. The other 2 couldn't be identified from available records, but there was no foundation nearby. The voices on the recording had said, "beneath the foundation," but we were in the middle of forest. No structures, no roads, nothing paved, until the investigators found the property records. In 1951, a hunting cabin had been built in that exact location. The cabin had been occupied by a man named Leonard Fisk, a recluse who lived alone and worked as a fur trapper. The cabin burned down in 1962 and the site was abandoned. The forest reclaimed it over the decades, and by the time I placed my recording equipment there, no visible trace of the cabin remained. Leonard Fisk had disappeared around the time of the fire. He was never found. Authorities at the time assumed he died in the blaze, but no body was recovered. The foundation of his cabin sat beneath 2 feet of soil and forest debris, directly over the remains. The voices I'd recorded were discussing those remains, warning about them, trying to reveal what Leonard Fisk had done. But the speakers themselves were never identified. No missing person reports matched the voices. No one came forward claiming to have been near the site. Dr. Keene developed a theory. She believed the recordings weren't capturing contemporary events, but were somehow accessing past sounds, conversations that had occurred decades ago. Maybe the location itself held acoustic imprints, echoes of trauma that could be detected by sensitive equipment. Or maybe the dead were speaking. The victims, or the people who'd known about the murders, or witnesses who'd been silenced. Maybe they'd been trying to tell someone for 60 years, and modern recording technology finally let them be heard. The remains were recovered and buried properly. The families of the 2 identified victims held services. The case was officially designated a cold case homicide, with Leonard Fisk as the primary suspect. though he was presumed deceased. I continued my research, but I moved my recording locations away from that site. I couldn't work there anymore. Couldn't listen to the forest without hearing those voices, warning me, accusing me, asking why I was listening. Because here's what I realized. I'd been hearing them for weeks before I paid attention. The equipment had captured fragments of those conversations on multiple occasions, but I'd dismissed them as background noise or interference. I'd ignored them because they didn't fit what I was looking for. How many other recordings contain voices we're not listening for? How many hours of environmental audio collected by researchers like me all over the world include the dead trying to speak? The recording units are still out there, running continuously, capturing everything, and sometimes, in the middle of the night in places where no one should be, they record conversations about crimes we've forgotten, about bodies we haven't found, about secrets buried beneath foundations we can't see anymore. If you work with audio equipment, if you analyze sound, if you listen to recordings from remote places, pay attention, not just to what you're expecting to hear, but to the voices underneath, the fragments that don't make sense, the words spoken in places that should be empty, because the dead don't always stay silent. Sometimes they find ways to speak. And if you're listening at 3:37 in the morning, in the right place with the right equipment, you might hear them tell you where the bodies are buried. The school bus stopped at a location that hadn't been a scheduled stop for 40 years, and when the driver opened the doors, something got on. I was reviewing GPS tracking data for the district's buses when I noticed the anomaly. Bus 17, driven by Frank Kowalchuk, had made an unscheduled stop on Dents Run Road at 7:42 in the morning. The bus had remained stationary for 3 minutes before continuing its route. My name is Caroline Richter. I'm 42 years old, and I serve as the transportation coordinator for the Elk County School District. I manage bus routes, driver schedules, and safety protocols for 37 buses serving communities across 600 square miles of rural Pennsylvania. Benezet is one of our most remote pickup zones, a tiny community best known for its elk herd and forest access. Unscheduled stops are a safety concern and a policy violation. Drivers are required to report any deviations from their assigned routes immediately. Frank hadn't reported the stop. I called him during his lunch break and asked about the incident. He was quiet for several seconds before responding. "I didn't make an unscheduled stop," he said. "The GPS data shows you stopped on Dents Run Road for 3 minutes." Another pause. "Caroline, I stopped at every scheduled location on my route, same as always. I didn't deviate." I pulled up the route map and compared it to the GPS log. Frank's scheduled stops included 5 locations along Dents Run Road, all marked clearly on the map. But the GPS showed a 6th stop, positioned between 2 scheduled locations, at coordinates that didn't correspond to any residence or designated pickup point. "Frank, do you remember stopping between the Morrison place and the old church? Around 7:42? "The old church isn't a stop anymore. Hasn't been for years." "I know, but the data shows you stopped there." "Carolina, I'm telling you, I didn't stop there. I drove past it like I always do." I pulled Frank's route camera footage. All district buses have forward-facing cameras that record continuously during operation. I reviewed the footage from that morning, watching the timestamp carefully. At 7:39, Frank approached the Morrison residence. He stopped, picked up 2 children, and continued. At 7:41, he was driving along Dents Run Road. And at 7:42, he slowed down. The bus came to a complete stop in front of an old stone church that sat back from the road, surrounded by overgrown grass and trees. The building had been abandoned for decades. I remembered hearing it had been a one-room schoolhouse before becoming a church, and it had closed sometime in the 1980s. On the footage, Frank's hand reached for the door control. The doors opened, and 3 children climbed aboard. They appeared on camera for maybe 2 seconds as they ascended the steps. Children dressed in clothing that looked odd, dated, formal, like something from the 1960s or 70s. 2 boys and a girl, all appearing to be around 8 to 10 years old. Their faces were visible but blurred, as if the camera couldn't quite focus on them. They moved past the driver's seat toward the back of the bus, out of the camera's forward view. The doors closed and Frank continued driving. I rewound the footage and watched again. Same thing. 3 children boarding. Frank didn't acknowledge them, didn't speak to them, didn't check their names against his roster. Just opened the doors, let them on, and drove. I called Frank back immediately. "Frank, I need you to be honest with me. Did you pick up 3 children this morning at the old church?" "What?" "No." "Caroline, I picked up the regular kids at the regular stops. I'm looking at the footage right now. 3 children got on your bus at that location." Silence. "Frank, I don't remember that. I drove the route. Same as every day. If something got on the bus, I didn't see it." "How do you not see children getting on your bus?" "I don't know." I reviewed the footage from the rest of Frank's route. The camera didn't show the interior of the bus, only the forward view through the windshield. I couldn't see where the 3 children went or what they did. But at each subsequent stop, when students boarded, I watched carefully. The children getting on looked normal, recognizable. I knew most of their families. At the final stop, the high school, students disembarked. Frank parked the bus and completed his morning route. Total passenger count logged by the district, 14 students matching the roster exactly. No record of the 3 children from the old church. I contacted the principal at the elementary school and asked if any students had reported seeing unfamiliar children on bus 17 that morning. 2 students came forward. A 4th grader named Mason Tully said he'd seen 3 kids sitting in the back row of the bus, in seats that were usually empty. He'd thought they were new students. He'd tried to say hello, but they hadn't responded. When the bus arrived at school, Mason looked back and the seats were empty. He'd assumed the kids had gotten off quickly. A 3rd grader named Iris Kephart reported the same thing. 3 children in old-fashioned clothes, sitting silently in the back. She said they'd been whispering to each other, but she couldn't hear the words. She'd felt cold sitting near them, even though the bus was warm. I pulled Frank from driving duties pending investigation and assigned a substitute to his route. Then I contacted the state police and reported the incident as a potential unauthorized boarding or safety violation. Trooper Angela Ward took the report but seemed skeptical. "You're telling me 3 kids got on a school bus, rode to school, and disappeared?" "I'm telling you, the camera shows 3 children boarding. Students report seeing them, but there's no record of them, and the driver doesn't remember picking them up." Trooper Ward agreed to investigate. She interviewed Frank, reviewed the footage, and spoke with the students. Her conclusion was that the footage showed an unexplained anomaly, but without evidence of a crime or ongoing danger, there was little she could do. "Could be a glitch," she suggested. "Video artifact, compression error, something that looks like people but isn't." 2 students saw them. "It's not just the video." "Then maybe someone's kids caught a ride without permission. It happens. They got off before school and walked away." But that didn't explain the clothing, the blurred faces, or Frank's complete lack of memory. I decided to investigate the old church. I drove to Benazet on a Saturday morning and located the building on Dents Run Road. It sat about 30 yards back from the road, accessible by an overgrown dirt path. The structure was small, maybe 40 feet by 20 feet, built of stone and timber with a collapsed roof and broken windows. I approached on foot, carrying my phone and a flashlight. The front door was missing, the opening covered by vines and debris. I pushed through and entered. The interior was gutted. Rotted pews stacked against one wall, holes in the floor, vegetation growing through cracks. But at the far end of the building, where an altar or pulpit would have been, Someone had arranged objects, children's items, a doll, a toy truck, a lunchbox, a pair of small shoes, all old, weathered, left there intentionally. And beside them, photographs. Dozens of photographs, some in frames, some loose, all showing children. Black and white images, color Polaroids, school portraits from different eras. I photographed the display with my phone, then searched the rest of the building. In what had been a small back room, maybe a storage area or office, I found writing on the wall, names and dates carved into the wood paneling. Martin Brewer, 1962 Susan Collar, 1963 Timothy Vance, 1966. 18 names total, spanning from 1947 to 1979. All with dates, all appearing to be children's names. I took pictures of everything and left. Back in my car, I searched for information about the church. The building had been called Dents Run Community Church, operating from 1923 until 1983. Before that, the structure had served as a one-room schoolhouse. Dents Run School, which closed in 1952 when the district consolidated. The names carved into the wall matched records of students who'd attended Dents Run School. But more than that, they matched records of children who died. I found obituaries, news articles, and death certificates. All 18 names belonged to children from the Benezet area who had died between 1947 and 1979. Accidents, illnesses, drownings. None of them died at the school itself, but all had attended classes there before it closed. Someone had been memorializing them in that building, leaving toys and photographs, carving their names into the wall. But the question was, who had been doing it? And were those 3 children on the bus connected to the memorial? I showed the photographs to local historians and elderly residents. One woman, Edith Carmichael, who was 91 and had lived in Benezet her entire life, recognized the display. "That's old Marion's shrine," she said. "Marion Halstead. She was the last teacher at the school before it closed. She took it hard when they shut it down. All those children she taught, some of them had died over the years, and she felt like closing the school meant forgetting them. So she kept going there, even after it became a church, and she'd leave things to remember them by." When did Marion die? 1989. But even after she died, people said you could still see her at the church sometimes, standing at the door, waiting, like she was still watching for the children to come to school. I asked if Edith remembered any stories about the children themselves returning. She nodded slowly. People used to say the school was haunted. Children's voices at night, footsteps in the building when it was empty. The church congregation tried to use the building in the 60s and 70s, but they couldn't keep members. People felt unwelcome, like the space wasn't meant for adults anymore. Just children. Has anyone reported seeing the children recently? Not that I've heard, but I don't get out much. Maybe they're back. I reported everything to Trooper Ward. She contacted the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office and inquired about the building's status. It was designated as historically significant, but not protected. The landowner had no plans for it. Ward recommended the shrine be documented and potentially removed for safety reasons, but she had no authority to investigate alleged hauntings. I made one more decision. I assigned a different driver to Frank's route and changed the schedule to avoid passing directly by the old church. The new route added 4 minutes but bypassed Dents Run Road entirely. The GPS anomalies stopped. No more unscheduled stops. No more footage of children boarding the bus. But students on other routes began reporting similar experiences. Children in old-fashioned clothing appearing in empty seats, whispering, disappearing before arrival at school. Always 3 of them, always silent except for the whisper. 5 different buses over 3 months. Different routes, different drivers, different student witnesses, but always the same 3 children. I reviewed historical records for all 18 names carved into the wall. 3 of them had died together in a car accident in 1963. Martin Brewer, Susan Koller, and Daniel Farnham. They'd been siblings or close relatives riding in a vehicle that went off a bridge during a storm. The 3 children on the buses matched their ages and descriptions from the obituaries. I don't have an explanation. The district doesn't have a protocol for this. We document the incidents, we file reports, we ensure student safety, but we can't stop children who aren't alive from boarding buses that pass places they once knew. Frank Kowalchuk retired early. He said he couldn't drive anymore without wondering who was really on his bus. Other drivers have reported feeling watched, feeling cold spots near certain seats, hearing whispers in languages they can't quite make out. The old church still stands on Dents Run Road. The shrine is still there, and every few months, someone reports seeing 3 children standing beside the road at 7:42 in the morning, waiting, not for help, not for rescue, just waiting for the bus to stop, like they always did when they were alive, so they can go to school one more time. If you drive a school bus through rural areas where small schools have closed, pay attention to empty stops. Pay attention to doors that open when they shouldn't. Pay attention to seats that feel colder than others. Because some students never stop trying to get to school, and they'll take any bus that stops, riding along with the living, sitting quietly in the back, whispering about lessons they never finished and days they never got to complete. The construction plans showed rooms that didn't exist, and when the crew tried to build according to the specifications, they kept discovering spaces that shouldn't be possible. I was overseeing the renovation of the old Brownsville Hospital when my foreman brought me a problem. The blueprints didn't match the building, not in small ways, like measurements being off by inches, but in fundamental ways. The plans showed entire wings that weren't there. My name is Thomas Brennan. I'm 56 years old, and I've worked in commercial construction management for 30 years. I've renovated hundreds of buildings, schools, hospitals, office complexes, factories, and I understand how to read architectural plans, how to reconcile old drawings with modern standards, how to adapt to the inevitable surprises hiding inside old structures. But the Brownsville Hospital was different. The building had been constructed in 1923 as a 50-bed facility serving the Brownsville area of Fayette County. It operated until 2004, when a new hospital opened and the old building was abandoned. The structure sat empty for 20 years before a development company purchased it with plans to convert it into senior housing. I'd been hired to manage the renovation, and my crew had been on site for 3 weeks when the discrepancies became impossible to ignore. The blueprints we'd been given showed the building as a 3-story structure with 4 wings arranged around a central courtyard. Standard early 20th century hospital design. But when my crew began opening walls and stripping interiors, they found inconsistencies. Hallways that were 20 feet longer than the plans indicated. Rooms that shouldn't exist according to the drawings. Staircases that led to spaces not shown on any floor plan. My foreman, a man named Victor Salazar, brought me into the building's east wing on a Wednesday morning and showed me the problem. We were standing in what should have been a storage closet according to the blueprints. It was marked on the plans as 8 feet by 6 feet. The actual space was 60 feet deep. "There's no way this is a closet," Victor said. "It's a full corridor, and look at the end." The corridor terminated at a door. Heavy wood, institutional hardware, locked. The door didn't appear on the blueprints at all. I pulled out the architectural plans and verified the drawings. According to the documents, the storage closet backed up against an exterior wall. There should have been nothing beyond it except the outside of the building, but we were clearly inside, in a hallway that extended far beyond where the exterior wall should be. "Get bolt cutters," I said. "We need to see what's behind that door." Victor returned with tools and cut through the old lock. The door swung open, revealing another corridor. This one was wider, with doors lining both sides. Hospital rooms, maybe 12 of them, all empty. The walls were painted institutional green. The floors were covered in deteriorating linoleum. Everything looked original to the 1920s construction, but according to the blueprints, none of it existed. Victor and I walked the corridor, opening doors and documenting what we found. Empty patient rooms, a nurse's station, a small pharmacy, a utility room. All furnished with original hospital equipment, metal beds, rolling carts, medicine cabinets, everything covered in decades of dust. At the end of the corridor was another staircase, descending. According to the building's design, we were on the first floor. There should be no basement level. We descended the stairs. The basement level was massive. Corridors extended in multiple directions, lined with more doors. We explored for 90 minutes, finding operating rooms, examination rooms, storage areas, a morgue with refrigerated compartments, and a large laundry facility with industrial washers and dryers still in place. None of it appeared on the blueprints. I called the developer, Richard Holloway, and explained the situation. He was skeptical until I sent him photographs and video footage. Then he drove to the site immediately. Richard reviewed the blueprints, walked through the discovered spaces, and examined property records on his laptop. His conclusion was that the building had been expanded at some point after the original construction, but the additions were never documented in official plans. "It happens," he said, "especially with older buildings, additions, renovations, changes that don't get properly recorded. We'll just have to survey everything from scratch and create new plans." But that didn't explain how the additions had been physically possible. I walked the exterior of the building multiple times. The dimensions matched the original blueprints exactly. The footprint was correct. There was no space for the additional wings and corridors we discovered inside. The building's interior was larger than its exterior. I hired a professional surveying team to map the structure completely. They spent 4 days measuring every room, every hallway, every staircase. Their findings were impossible. The interior measurements totaled over 200,000 square feet across 4 levels. The exterior measurements totaled 90,000 square feet across 3 levels. The building contained more than twice the space that its physical dimensions allowed. The surveyors had no explanation. One of them, a man named Philip Chen, said it was the first time in his career he'd encountered a structure that defied basic geometry. "Either our equipment is malfunctioning," he said, "or this building doesn't follow normal spatial rules." We tested the equipment. Everything functioned correctly. Richard wanted to proceed with the renovation despite the anomalies. He argued that we'd simply work with the space we found, regardless of how it related to the plans. But my crew began refusing to work in certain areas of the building. They reported hearing sounds, footsteps in empty corridors, voices echoing from rooms that had no occupants, the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment from spaces that had no power. Several workers reported seeing movement in their peripheral vision, figures in white coats or nursing uniforms that vanished when looked at directly. One worker, a carpenter named Luis Medina, refused to return after the second week. He'd been installing drywall in one of the discovered patient rooms when he heard someone behind him. He turned and saw a man in a hospital gown standing in the doorway, pale and thin, staring at him. Luis called out, asking if he needed help. The figure turned and walked away down the corridor. Luis followed, but the corridor was empty. When he returned to the room, his tools had been rearranged and someone had written on the wall in pencil. We never left. I documented every incident and reported them to Richard. He hired a historian to research the building's past, hoping to find explanations for the extra spaces and the reported phenomena. The historian, Dr. Vivian Marks, uncovered disturbing information. Between 1935 and 1947, Brownsville Hospital had been involved in experimental treatments for tuberculosis and psychiatric conditions. The hospital had received state and federal funding to conduct research, and during that period, the facility had expanded significantly. But there were no building permits for the expansion. No architectural drawings filed with the county, no official record of construction. Dr. Marks found records indicating that during those 12 years, the hospital had treated far more patients than its official capacity allowed. The documented bed count was 50, but patient admission logs showed hundreds of individuals being treated simultaneously. They were hiding patients, Dr. Marks explained, or hiding the treatment, building unauthorized spaces, keeping people in areas that weren't supposed to exist, conducting procedures that wouldn't have been approved if anyone knew about them. She found death records too. Over 200 patients died at Brownsville Hospital between 1935 and 1947. Most were listed as tuberculosis or pneumonia victims. But several families had filed complaints claiming their relatives had been subjected to unauthorized procedures, experimental treatments, and neglect. The complaints were dismissed. The hospital continued operating until 2004 with no public acknowledgement of its past. But the unauthorized spaces remained. The hidden wings, the basement levels, the rooms that existed in dimensions the building shouldn't contain, and the people who died there never left. My crew walked off the job in the 8th week. They refused to continue working in a building where doors opened by themselves, where voices called their names from empty rooms, where they found personal belongings they hadn't brought appearing in their tool bags. Richard attempted to hire a new crew. They lasted 3 days before quitting for the same reasons. The renovation was abandoned. The building remains sealed. Richard's development company dissolved, citing financial losses. The property reverted to the county. I've reviewed the documentation dozens of times since then, trying to understand what we encountered. The blueprints show one building. The surveyors measured a completely different structure. And somewhere in between, hidden in spaces that shouldn't exist, are rooms full of people who were treated, experimented on, forgotten, and left to die in a hospital that kept expanding into dimensions no one was watching. Dr. Marks believes the building was designed with hidden spaces intentionally, that the architects worked with the hospital administrators to create a structure where unauthorized activities could occur without detection. But that doesn't explain the impossible geometry. That doesn't explain how a 90,000 square foot building contains 200,000 square feet of interior space, unless the space itself was part of the experiment, unless the hospital was testing more than just medical treatments, unless they were trying to see what happens when you build in directions that shouldn't exist, when you expand into dimensions that geometry says aren't there. And maybe they succeeded. Maybe they created spaces where the normal rules don't apply, where people can be hidden, where the dead can remain for decades after their bodies are gone. The building still stands on 3rd Street in Brownsville, boarded up, condemned, officially designated as structurally unsound. But sometimes, late at night, people report seeing lights in the windows of wings that don't exist. They hear sounds that shouldn't be possible from a building with no power. And occasionally, someone exploring the property without permission enters through a broken window or forced door, looking for salvage or shelter. Most come back out within minutes, terrified and disoriented. They report getting lost in corridors that loop back on themselves, in stairwells that descend far deeper than the building's height should allow, in rooms that seem to shift position when they're not looking. A few never come back out at all. Their families file missing person reports. Police search the building, finding nothing. But the structure has more rooms than anyone can map, more space than should exist, and somewhere in those impossible corridors, the lost are still wandering. If you're ever working on a renovation project and the blueprints don't match the building, stop. Don't keep exploring. Don't try to make sense of it. Because sometimes buildings hide things deliberately, and sometimes what they're hiding has been waiting decades for someone to find them. The dead patients of Brownsville Hospital aren't resting. They're still receiving treatment in rooms that don't exist, following routines in spaces that shouldn't be there, maintained by staff who never left their posts. and they're always looking for new admissions.